So today, if you turn on the news, or just scroll through a social feed, Islamic politics and culture are usually painted as this single rigid block.
Oh, yeah, completely monolithic.
Right. Like, the popular perception is basically that the Muslim world has looked and operated the exact same way for centuries. But, I mean, if you rewind the clock to just the eve of the modern era, you find a wildly different reality.
You really did?
You find this highly pluralistic, globalized powerhouse. Kings, scholars, and mystics were actively maintaining like a deliberate separation between state power and religious authority.
And that contrast between our modern perception and the historical reality is just staggering. I mean, when we look at the Muslim world before the full impact of European colonialism, we are examining the most widely dispersed, globalized civilization on the planet.
Wow.
Yeah, this was a cultural and economic network stretching all the way from the Atlantic coast of West Africa and Morocco, completely across the Middle East, deep into Central Asia, and, sprawling right into China, the Malay Archipelago.
Which is huge. So that transformation going from this vibrant, decentralized global network into the highly complex, contested political landscape we see today, that is our mission for this deep dive.
Exactly.
We want to give you, the listener, a shortcut to understanding the deep historical roots of modern Islamic politics, really looking far beyond the daily headlines.
Getting into the real foundation of it.
Right. And to do this, we're unpacking a really comprehensive academic overview by Robert W. Hefner. It's titled Introduction: Muslims and Modernity, Culture and Society in an Age of Contest and Plurality. And this is from the New Cambridge History of Islam.
It's a fantastic source for this.
It really is. So to understand how things changed so drastically, we have to look closely at how that pre-modern ecosystem actually functioned. Because unlike pre-modern Christianity in Europe, there was no pope.
Right, there was no pope. And the absence of a centralized hierarchical church or an ordained priesthood is really the defining feature of classical Islamic organization.
So how did it work then?
Well, in pre-modern Europe, the church basically dictated a singular authoritative version of the faith. But in the Muslim world, religious authority was deliberately fractured. It was divided into three distinct competing streams.
Okay, let's unpack this. What was the first stream?
First, there were the ulama. These are the formal scholars of the law, the Sharia.
The legal expert. Yeah.
Exactly. They dedicated their entire lives to studying the Quran, the traditions of the Prophet, and complex legal jurisprudence.
Yeah.
They were really the intellectual anchors of the faith.
But they weren't the only ones holding influence, right? Because the second stream consisted of the Sufis, the mystics.
Right.
While the ulama were focused on strict legal texts in the big urban centers, the Sufis were out appealing to ordinary believers and borderland populations.
Yeah, they had a totally different approach.
They focused on a highly emotive, accessible, personal experience of God. And in doing so, they frequently incorporated local customs, healing practices, and saint veneration. They were the ones adapting the religion to local cultures as it expanded into places like, West Africa or Indonesia.
Yeah, they made it localized. And then the third stream of authority rested with imperial Islam. So the kings, sultans, and rulers.
Oh, politicians.
But they weren't simply secular administrators taking orders from the scholars. They actually viewed themselves as culture makers. They utilized their massive state resources to sponsor monumental architecture, the arts, and scientific advancement.
To reflect the glory of the civilization.
Exactly. I mean, when the Mughal emperor Shah Jahan spent 17 years building the Taj Mahal in India, he wasn't just building a magnificent tomb.
Oh, it was way more than that.
It was designed as a profound allegorical commentary on the Islamic Day of Judgment. It was a clear statement that the majesty of Islam could be expressed through unbounded cultural and architectural genius.
Entirely separate from the strict legal conformity demanded by the ulama.
Yes.
So you have the scholars guarding the law, the mystics expanding the spiritual reach, and the kings building the cultural infrastructure. It operates, honestly, a lot like open source software.
Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, I mean, you have this foundational core code, the Quran, and the traditions of the Prophet. But because there is no central tech monopoly, no pope dictating a single final product, you have all these local developers constantly creating different localized versions of the software.
Right.
So a version that works in the courts of Istanbul looks very different from the version operating in a village in Sumatra.
What's fascinating here is why this lack of a central church was actually a source of massive cultural vitality. It allowed Islam to adapt to incredibly diverse environments without breaking apart.
Even though it created tension.
Oh, definitely. It did generate a permanent underlying tension between the theological ideal of perfect Muslim unity and the practical reality of extreme social diversity.
Yeah.
But for centuries, they managed this tension remarkably well.
And a cornerstone of that stability was a de facto separation of state and religion, which honestly challenges a lot of
It
assumptions.
really does.
Because the prevailing stereotype today is that Islamic history has always been characterized by a total fusion of church and state, where the religious leaders and the political leaders are one and exactly the same.
But the historical texts reveal a very different dynamic. For centuries, the most respected religious scholars actively avoided serving in the state bureaucracy.
Really? They didn't want the power.
No, they viewed the political realm as inherently corrupting. Rulers had to manage the messy realities of warfare, taxation, statecraft, which, often required moral compromises. The scholars wanted to protect the purity of the faith from the political intrigues of self-interested kings. There is actually a famous historical tradition, frequently cited by these classical scholars, of 3 judges, 2 are in hell.
Of 3 judges, 2 are in hell. Wow, that is a brilliantly blunt warning.
Isn't it?
It implies that if you take a government position as a judge, the pressure from the ruler to issue a ruling that benefits the state, rather than a ruling that follows pure justice, will almost certainly compromise your soul.
Exactly. The scholars understood that proximity to absolute political power usually means compromising religious integrity, so they maintained their distance.
The kings handled the swords and the taxes, the ulama handled the law and theology, and the Sufis handled the spiritual and community life.
A delicate balance.
It sounds incredibly resilient as a decentralized ecosystem, but it relied on the Muslim world holding the ultimate economic and technological upper hand globally. So what happens to this delicate balance when that global power dynamic flips virtually overnight?
The result was a traumatic, systemic shock. I mean, for 1,000 years, Muslims had grown accustomed to viewing their civilization as the absolute foremost in global trade, scientific innovation, and military power.
The top of the food chain.
Right. But as the Industrial Revolution took hold in Europe, driving massive leaps in Western military and economic capabilities, that long-standing Muslim advantage just evaporated.
European powers began rapidly expanding.
Yeah. The British East India Company dismantled local power in Bengal. The Dutch seized control of the highly lucrative spice trade in the Indonesian archipelago. The Russians began pushing aggressively into Central Asia.
While the French and British carved up territories across Africa and the Middle East, the source text describes this as triggering a profound crisis of cultural confidence.
And you can see why.
Imagine living within that society. The economic foundations are collapsing, foreign armies are dictating terms, and your entire world order is being upended. In that environment of existential threat, that vibrant pluralism, all those local open source adaptations, the accommodating Sufis, the kings negotiating with the West, suddenly stops looking like cultural vitality and starts looking like a fatal weakness.
Well, when any society is placed under severe, sustained external threat, the immediate instinct is to consolidate. Pluralism is viewed as division, and division is viewed as vulnerability.
Right.
This existential crisis provoked loud, urgent cries for internal Muslim unity to resist the colonizers. And this specific environment birthed the early conservative reform movements. We see the rise of figures like Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab in the Arabian Peninsula.
And the Padri movement in Sumatra and the Faraiti movement in Bengal. Now, as a quick rule reminder for our listeners, we're looking at this strictly as impartial history. We're presenting the rise of Wahhabism and these other reforms purely as historical reactions to societal upheaval and colonialism.
Exactly. We're just tracing the historical cause and effect.
So looking at the historical emergence of these movements, it's clear they weren't born in a vacuum. These early reformists looked at the rapid collapse of their societies and diagnosed the problem. They argued that the root cause of their weakness against the West was that Muslims had abandoned pure Islamic law.
Yes. They pointed to the Sufis who had incorporated local customs. They pointed to the political elites who were compromising with European powers, and they labeled all of it as corruption.
Their solution was an uncompromising return to scripture, stripping away centuries of localized culture. But wait, so were these early reform movements strictly religious, or were they actually a form of political rebellion?
Oh, it was contentious politics, through and through. If we look closely at where these movements gained the most traction, it was almost always in regions where Western economic incursions had already completely unhinged the traditional social order.
The old system was already broken.
Right. The old local elites, that traditional alliance of the court, the Sufis, and the scholars, they were failing to protect the population. They were buckling under the pressure.
So for disenfranchised groups living through this upheaval, calling for a strict puritanical religious reform was a highly effective mechanism to challenge those established failing hierarchies.
Exactly. When a society is reeling under the impact of colonial extraction and the local rulers appear weak or compromised by foreign overlords,
Yeah.
invoking the absolute purity of God's law is a highly potent tool for mobilization.
It provides a moral framework to overthrow the old regime and organize resistance.
The theology and the political rebellion were inextricably linked. It was a language of social revolution wrapped entirely in the banner of religious purification.
But ideas and calls for revolution, they don't just spread on their own. How did these reformist critiques actually manage to reach the masses and bypass the traditional scholars who had held authority for centuries?
They used the very technologies that the European colonizers brought with them. The technologies of change fundamentally rewired the physical and intellectual infrastructure of the Muslim world. And the first major shift came with steamships and the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869.
Because prior to this, the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, was a grueling, dangerous journey that relatively few could undertake, right?
Exactly. But steam travel dramatically lowered the cost and danger. The flow of pilgrims surged exponentially. Suddenly, Muslims from West Africa, India, and Indonesia were meeting in Mecca in unprecedented numbers.
Exchanging ideas, debating these new reformist critiques, and taking those unified concepts back to their local communities. So steamships moved the people, but the printing press moved the ideas.
Yes.
And the source text points out that the traditional ulama, the established scholars, initially fiercely resisted mass printing. They didn't just dislike the technology, they saw it as an existential threat.
And they were right to fear it. For centuries, Islamic scholarship relied on oral transmission and rigorous, localized apprenticeships. You studied a text face-to-face with a master.
Quality control.
Exactly. The scholars believed that unauthorized, mass-produced texts would destroy the rigorous quality control they had maintained over the religion's interpretation. They even successfully lobbied the Ottoman government to shut down some of the early Muslim-operated presses.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. It's almost exactly like the modern internet, right? Democratizing information, but also destroying quality control. Doesn't that mean anyone with a printing press could suddenly claim to be a religious authority, sweeping aside centuries of careful scholarship?
That was exactly the threat the ulama feared. Mass printing created a disruptive new social category, the autodidact, or the self-taught intellectual.
The autodidact.
Yeah. Before the printing press, if someone wanted to debate theology, they had to spend decades mastering classical Arabic and studying under recognized scholars.
You couldn't just jump in.
Right. But with the printing press, a young, literate person in a provincial town could simply buy a stack of mass-printed pamphlets, read them independently, and begin preaching a new, reformist vision.
Imagine the friction that creates on a local level. You have a village elder who spent 20 years studying under traditional ulama, and suddenly a 20-year-old with a printed pamphlet can stand up in the courtyard and challenge his authority, claiming the elder's practices are outdated corruptions.
It completely democratized access to information, but it bypassed the traditional gatekeepers entirely.
It shifted Islam from a classical scholarly tradition to a mass media discourse.
And as this mass media environment expanded, the desire for reform splintered into different strategic paths. On one side, you had the modernists.
What was their approach?
They argued that to survive, Muslims needed to adopt Western scientific methods and institutional models while retaining a strong Islamic moral framework. The Muhammadiyah organization in Indonesia, founded in 1912, is a prime example.
Right, focusing their energy on social welfare, building thousands of modern schools, clinics, and dozens of universities. But other groups took a very different path. You had the strict constructionists, who were deeply skeptical of adopting anything resembling a European curriculum.
The Deobandi movement in India illustrates this path perfectly. Living under direct British colonial rule, they lacked any sympathetic state power to protect their culture. So rather than building modern universities, they focused entirely on grassroots religious schooling.
To ensure absolute personal conformity to Islamic law.
Yes, they established massive networks of madrasas across South Asia, aiming to protect the faith from the ground up, isolating their communities from Western cultural influence.
So we see this massive proliferation of grassroots forces, empowered by print and new transportation. Fast forward to the mid-20th century, decolonization sweeps the globe. These nations finally gain independence. But rather than embracing these grassroots Islamic movements, the newly minted post-colonial leaders attempt to suppress them by importing Western-style secular nationalism.
The mid-20th century represents a fascinating secular interregnum. In places like Turkey, leaders like Ataturk implemented aggressive, systematic programs of state secularization. They abolished the caliphate entirely, heavily restricted traditional religious education, and relegated Sharia mostly to domestic matters, like family law and inheritance.
And in other newly independent nations, authoritarian regimes maintained a modest, state-controlled Islamic facade to placate the public, but they actively marginalized independent religious movements. Their focus was entirely on building state-led economies.
But that secular suppression ultimately failed. By the 1970s and 80s, the Muslim world experienced a massive, unprecedented grassroots Islamic resurgence.
And the catalyst wasn't just a sudden shift in theology, was it?
No, it was driven by a brutal demographic and economic reality. Between 1950 and 1990, the Muslim world experienced an explosive demographic boom coupled with massive rural-to-urban migration. Cities grew by 200 to 300% in just a few decades.
The scale of this urbanization was completely unmanageable for these developing states. The secular nationalist governments had dismantled traditional rural social structures to modernize, but their state-led economies failed to provide the promised industrial jobs.
As a result, millions of young people who were often the first generation in their families to achieve basic literacy found themselves crammed into sprawling urban slums, dealing with severe pollution, rising crime, crushing unemployment.
And highly corrupt authoritarian states that offered no political voice. So, if the secular state has failed to provide a functioning economy, and the government has banned all traditional political opposition parties, where does a frustrated, literate, unemployed youth population turn?
The mosque became the only safe space.
It was the one institution the state couldn't completely outlaw for public assembly, so it transformed from a simple place of worship into the central hub for community organization, social services, and sharp political critique.
Millions of frustrated citizens turned to cheap, mass-printed Islamic literature and cassette tapes of fiery sermons to find alternative answers. And this environment forged the massive Islamic resurgence.
Which brings up one of the most complex outcomes of this period. Think about how we usually view this in the West. The source calls it the gender paradox of the resurgence.
The veil emerged as a highly visible, potent symbol of this new urban piety.
Right, and this requires careful examination, because the Western lens almost exclusively views the veil as a mechanism of restriction and forced segregation. But how can we reconcile the idea of the veil as a restrictive tool with the historical reality that it actually facilitated a massive wave of women entering public life and universities?
This raises an important question. The mechanics of this are crucial to understanding agency in a rapidly shifting society. While conservative male leaders certainly promoted veiling as a way to reassert patriarchal authority, millions of young women actively chose to adopt the veil for highly pragmatic reasons.
Interesting.
In these newly chaotic, overcrowded urban spaces where rural families were often deeply anxious about the moral dangers of the city, the veil acted as a kind of moral passport.
A moral passport.
Yes. It provided unquestionable visual proof of a woman's piety and respectability. By adopting it, young women gained the social cover and familial permission they needed to leave the confines of the home.
It allowed them to ride public transit safely, enroll in state universities, and enter the modern workforce. It facilitated an unprecedented level of female civic activism that simply doesn't fit into neat categories of liberal liberation or conservative subjugation.
It fundamentally reshaped the demographics of public life.
So we have this massive grassroots empowerment driven by urbanization, mass education, the failure of secular states, and new media. Naturally, this energy spills directly into the political arena, bringing us to the ultimate question facing the Muslim world today. Does a truly Islamic society require a centralized Islamic state to enforce the law, Or does state power actually corrupt the religion?
The Islamic resurgence has completely splintered over this exact question. On one end of the spectrum, you have movements that demand a totalizing absolute union of religion and state power.
Like the Taliban.
Right. They argue that the only way to cure society's ills is for the government to mandate and violently enforce a strict interpretation of Sharia. These totalizing groups are frequently sustained by transnational funding networks.
But the sources dedicate significant attention to a powerful internal counter-movement that often gets drowned out in global headlines. Civic pluralist Islam.
Yes, led by intellectual figures like Abdul Karim Soroush in Iran and the late Nuralish Majid in Indonesia.
They forcefully argue that the demand to fuse state and religion isn't a return to pure tradition at all. They argue it is actually a modern obsession, mimicking the coercive power of the modern European nation-state. Let me quote the Iranian dissident Abdul Karim Soroush here. He says, "Religion forbids us from assuming a godlike character."
The mechanism behind his argument is profound. If you create an absolute Islamic state, you are giving flawed, self-interested human politicians the coercive power of the government, while allowing them to claim they speak with the infallible voice of God.
Right.
When that state inevitably makes a corrupt decision or oppresses its people, the population doesn't just lose faith in the government, they lose faith in Islam itself. The state's failures are blamed on God.
So to protect the religion from the corruption of politics, the pluralists argue you must separate religious authority from state power. So what does this all mean? Are these pluralists just trying to copy Western democracy, or if they are actually building a uniquely Islamic democratic model based on that original pre-modern open source pluralism we talked about at the start?
It's an entirely internal, organically Islamic defense of democratic principles. They are not advocating for religion to be banished from public life like, say, in France.
Right.
Instead, they point out that in classical Islamic civilization, the state and the ulama were specifically designed to balance and check one another, not control one another. The pluralists want to ground public Islamic values in vibrant citizen associations and civil society.
Defending those values through constitutional checks and balances rather than authoritarian force. Well, we've traced the massive arc of this civilization's political evolution. We started with the resilient open source pluralism of the pre-modern era, where scholars, mystics, and kings maintained a delicate balance. We saw how the brutal economic and military shock of colonialism shattered that balance, triggering demands for strict unity and reform.
And we watched as steamships and mass printing bypassed the traditional gatekeepers, democratizing authority.
And finally, we saw how the failure of mid-century secular nationalism and massive urban demographic booms fueled a grassroots resurgence that is now actively debating the very nature of state and faith. The defining takeaway here is that the Muslim world isn't a monolith trapped in the past. It is a deeply dynamic civilization, actively debating its future using its own historical tools.
And as we close this deep dive, there's a final thought I want to leave everyone to mull over. We detailed how the introduction of the printing press fundamentally disrupted the traditional scholars, decentralized religious authority, and sparked the 20th century resurgence. As we look at the present day, what will the explosion of artificial intelligence and smartphone connectivity do to the next generation of Islamic political thought? If anyone anywhere can instantly generate a highly complex religious ruling of fatwa using an AI algorithm trained on centuries of texts, where does legitimate authority actually live next?
Wow, I mean, talk about rewriting the open source code all over again.